everyone, and thanks for joining us today for the Vietnam market briefing and cultural awareness training. It's great to see so many of you on the webinar today. We're going to do a deep dive into the wine market in Vietnam, as well as taking a closer look at the cultural aspects of doing business there. But before we begin, let's acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land.
We acknowledge the lands of the traditional custodians across Australia. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' continuing connection to land, water and sky country. We acknowledge the wine regions and hundreds of different nations around this continent and the ancient soils on which we stand and grow. From the Wadani saltwater peoples of the Margaret River in our west to the East Coast Sunrise people of the Yuin Nation and the Southern Island and Saltbush peoples of the Nione peoples of Tasmania. Saltwater peoples of the Margaret River in our west to the East Coast Sunrise people of the Yuin Nation and the Southern Island and Saltbush peoples of the Nione peoples of Tasmania. Today and always, we pay our deep respects to the custodians, those who went before and those who will follow, as the knowledge holders of tomorrow. This is Australia.
I would also like to acknowledge that we are coming to you from the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains and pay respect to elders past and present. We also extend that respect to other Aboriginal language groups and other First Nations. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Roberts, the Regional Manager for Asia Pacific at Wine Australia. Before we get into the content today, I've just got a little bit of housekeeping to take you through. At the right of your screen, you'll see the chat and Q&A functions. So please join the conversation. You can do that by posting directly into the chat, or to ask a question of any of the presenters today, simply click on the Add to Q&A button that you can see there. We've got experts today from Austrade in Vietnam and Valley Learning who will endeavour to answer as many questions as possible, time permitting. Any questions that can't be answered today, we'll follow up with you after the session. A recording of today's webinar will be emailed to all attendees tomorrow as well. And lastly, if you're having any technical issues, we recommend that you refresh your URL or your browser, or just pop a question into the chat and we'll see if we can help. So let's begin. First of all, I'd like to introduce Chris Morley, who is the Trade Commissioner for Austrade in Vietnam, who will give a market overview. He's also going to be joined by Han Nguyen, who's the Business Development Manager based in Ho Chi Minh City, to help answer any questions that you might have after his presentation. Thank you, Chris. Over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everyone. I hope you're all really well. I'm just going to share a file with you, so please bear with me as I get that up for you. And I'll just go back to where we want to start rather than where we left off in our practice. Yeah, as I said, thank you, Sarah, and really good to be here today representing Austrade. My name is Chris Morley. I hope I've met some of you on the call, but also look forward to meeting you again in the future. And to start with, we're going to talk a little bit about Vietnam as a market and then really sort of try and deep dive into some of the analysis we see from the wine industry. And I'm joined today, as Sarah mentioned, by Ms. Han Nguyen, who's part of our Ho Chi Minh team and forms part of our beverage sector team, along with Chi, who is based out of Hanoi with me. So a little bit about the Vietnam market. It's estimated about 100 million people in Vietnam. Importantly, the growth in Vietnam is something that's probably captured a lot of attention from not just wine producers, but a lot of other producers in other sectors, particularly food as well. And when we look at that GDP, you know, generally speaking, it's reasonably low compared to some of the other export markets. But we know that the emerging middle class that's occurring in Vietnam, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But the emerging middle class is estimated to be around sort of 15 to 20 million people right now, and going to get to about 30 million by 2030. And really that forms the part of the target market for Vietnam, and that those consumers that can afford to buy Australian products and recognise the value that Australian products bring. The other important area of Vietnam to talk about is prior to COVID, 18 million tourists visited Vietnam, and it was really on the rise as well. There's been significant investment into central areas of Vietnam. Some of you may have been to Hoi An or Da Nang as an example, and they're regions where we're seeing significant Western and other tourists go to the market as well, and certainly they were keen to enjoy fine wine and food when they were there at their 5-star hotel. And another important note is Vietnam has been open for international tourists since March this year. So the Vietnam government really recognised the importance of that sector and has removed needs for quarantines and COVID certificates and a whole lot of the other palaver that you may have faced when you're trying to travel again internationally. So Vietnam is open, and we'd love to see you up here in market, and certainly keen to acknowledge too some of the free trade agreements and the other agreements that we have in place. So the ANZFA, which government loves all these long acronyms that no one can say, but it's the ASEAN, Australia, and New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, which has significant trade reductions and tariff reductions that are going to occur over the next course of years, and the CPTPP and RCEP, which allow for different market access into the market as well. So there has been, I think, significant relations between Australia and Vietnam, which really does strengthen the relationship and also highlights the value that Vietnam places on Australian food and wine coming into the market. So we look at wine specifically. It's the third largest wine market within the ASEAN region. Significantly, though, the consumer in Vietnam does drink a lot less wine than what we may have seen in some other major markets. It's around about 0.2 of a litre per year the Vietnamese adult consumes. So whilst it may sound like a small market, given the size and the population, it actually leads to a lot more higher consumption. And I think if you look at the graph there, what it showed just prior to COVID, the uptick in Australian wine was really starting to take off. Granted, it's a fairly low base, but we were starting to make some really good gains into that market, and really were starting to grow and looking to take market share of some of those other European and Chilean counterparts as well. So 80% of the wine that comes into the market is imported, and our market value, as you can see there, did fall off significantly, but that's obviously, again, not surprising given what we've all just been through as well. And importantly, though, Australia is a top 4 player, a top 4 imported country for wine. So we are being recognised, and it's no surprise to see the other markets there that we often see in the other export markets as well. So that's a fairly good snapshot of where it's at right now. And importantly, to think about who actually drinks wine in Vietnam. So I mentioned before, the consumption of Vietnamese adults is quite low. Generally speaking, Vietnam is a beer drinking market, but it is shifting. And I think what's occurring with some of the wealth that's moving in that middle class is we are seeing a greater shift to consume something as a sophisticated Australian wine is viewed in market. So who's drinking? I mentioned tourists and Westerners before. Talking about Vietnam at the moment on the rise, you can't do it without talking about that upper middle class and the emerging middle class. And just to put that in a bit of context is, for all the investment that comes into Vietnam, if you look at the likes of, say, Lego opening their first factory, Pandora opening their first factory in Vietnam, as well as Google, Apple and Samsung, all moving manufacturing capacity into Vietnam, it's creating jobs, and they're high net worth jobs. And those jobs increase people's disposable income. And generally speaking, when you have increased disposable income, you're spending it on food, wine, education, healthcare. So they're 3 things that Australia does pretty well. And I think you'll see a lot more demand for a lot of Australian products as we continue this expansion in Vietnam over the next 3 years plus. Generally speaking, it's more males who are drinking wine or consume wine products. However, in the recent years, we also saw a lot of female-focused beverages and advertising or marketing towards female consumers really increase. And that's been a significant trend that we've seen occur over the past year or so. And also important to note the seasonality of wine consumption in Vietnam. And it's not dissimilar to other markets where Lunar New Year is celebrated, with the New Year for Tet in Vietnam being in late January this year, and obviously shifting between January and February each year. The real peak season for wine consumption and wine purchase is that November to February, and accounting for at least half to 70% of all sales. So it's quite a significant period for consumption within Vietnam. So this is a good slide, I think, looking at the average price points that we're seeing for wine in Vietnam. So looking at the entry level of the Australian price there of $5.60 to $16.80, which equates to 100,000 to 300,000 Vietnamese dong. That mid range there, up to 56 Australian dollars, and it's sort of 300,000 to $1 million dong, with premium wine being something over 56 Australian dollars. So generally, I think that market acceptance of around about Australian $34 mark is generally like the minimum price for high quality and good tasting wine that we see in market. And then looking at the different varietals, not too surprising to see red wine really leading the way. Favourites being Shiraz and Cab Sav, and the white wine that's really increasing in market share and increasing significantly is around the Rieslings and the Chardonnays. And certainly just a reminder too, just if you did have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and myself and Han will hopefully cover them off at the end of the presentation. So when we look at our competitors, I mentioned before that we're number 4 in the market in terms of preference. We're playing catch up, which isn't that surprising, and something that we usually do when we are entering these markets. So not an uncommon position for us to be in for some of these markets that we're really entering into. Italian wine leading the way there. Not surprising to see French wine popular, not just because of the quality the market produces, but also the significant cultural influence of France into Vietnam as well. So there is certainly some plays there around the culture and that history that comes into selection of products for Vietnam consumers. Wrong button, sorry. So looking at the overall increase of wine into Vietnam, overall sales of wine into Vietnam, the top line there is the total volume of wine that's been imported from Australia. And if we look down, the breakdown of the different states is reasonably interesting. Not surprising to see South Australia forming the bulk of that volume, but also looking at the sort of growth that has been occurring for Australia. We were increasing obviously before COVID, and then unfortunately hasn't. We were impacted by COVID, but it is picking up again reasonably quickly as well. So we're excited to see brands come into market and come in with a good value offering into Vietnam. This is pre-COVID, but looking at the different sales channels for wine. So generally speaking, it's convenience stores, it's the hypermarkets, the supermarkets. When we're looking at the off-trade, we're looking at the food and the tobacco and the drink specialist markets as well. So they're the sort of the major channels that we're seeing. We're not seeing a lot of, yes, e-commerce is there, but we're not seeing much alcohol being sold through that channel at all. This is sadly pre-COVID. We haven't been able to get the latest data to sort of identify what those markets look like now. Hopefully we would have that available for you in the future. But I think importantly, breakdown, looking at the on-trade is 80% and off-trade is 20%. So importantly now, how do we get the product into market? There are three tiers of tariff for the alcohol as it does enter into Vietnam. It can be quite a significant tariff for alcoholic beverages from Australia, but there is they are decreasing as the years go on, and it's something to be excited about. If you can get into market now and actually form a really good relationship, as that tariff reduces over the coming years, it does actually help out that relationship you have with your importer and distributor in market there. So the answer for one there is 20%. Then there's a consumption tax of 35%, and the VAT is there 8%. The other tariff barriers to be aware, the non-tariff barriers to be aware of, the import license, and then there's the other decrees on there. Actually, there was an interesting thing recently where when the drink driving law was introduced and some of the sales of wine significantly decreased. There are some other advertising constraints as well, but certainly we can go into those in more detail when you are looking to come into market and work with your partner there. Now, I think it's important to note that, Austrade, we are the trade and promotion agency and facilitation of trade and promotion of your products in market. So whilst we can help you, come into this market, the other thing we can also look to do is what promotions and activities and collaborations can we do in market. So recently we just concluded a series of 8 events with Wine Australia, where there were some private tastings and really showcasing some of the opportunities in market for the Australian wine. We're really keen to look at what other opportunities can come in to support market entry and support some tastings as needed with the different distributors, importers, retailers and buyers as well. So I think the important thing to note is that Austrade's here to help. We have offices in Hanoi, an office in Ho Chi Minh. We have a team of 5 who cover across our agribusiness and food and consumer. And we're here, we're well connected and looking forward to welcome you up into market. So I might conclude there and see if there's any questions in the chat from Sarah that myself or Han can potentially answer.
Hugely valuable information and really sort of sets a good idea of the landscape in Vietnam post COVID. I do have one question for you, and I don't know, maybe Han might be able to answer this one. Obviously, things shut down quite significantly over the past few years. Are you seeing much appetite yet amongst importers to take on new brands into their portfolio?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I'm not sure if Han's been able to join or can hear or not, but I'll give a bit of an insight and then hopefully Han can support. I think prior to COVID, there was a significant volume of Australian wine that did go into market, and there has been some issues around just clearing that through the traditional channels around food service and retail. So there was sort of periods of where there were more quantities of pre-existing wine in the market, and we really needed to work with those distributors and those brands to try and look at what activations we could do to clear that volume or that backlog, if you want, before new brands were sort of being more welcomed. So as that's continuing, we are seeing interest in new wine. I think it's important to note that it's not just at a food service and a food in a hotel sort of level. There is more interest around retail. But like all markets, it's about looking for those win-wins and looking for what as a wine brand, what can you bring to the table as well to support the distributor and the importer, the retailer, to help move the volume of it. It's not sort of, I guess there's a slightly increased emphasis on the wine producers and the brands to bring that additional value add right now. And that's going to sort of decrease a little bit as the wine does move. But certainly it's a good reminder to really bring your A game into Vietnam and think about what value add, what relationship building activities can you do to help entice someone to take your brand on.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. There's another question here about upcoming exhibitions or wine shows in Vietnam. And this, I don't know if you can answer this one now, if it's something we might need to take offline and get back to Aria on.
Yeah, look, I think the important one to note is that there's Food and Hotel Vietnam at the end of the year in December. There will be a pavilion at that show, and I believe there are some wine organisations that will be there. I think different states will have representation at that event as well. But in terms of, I think our direct involvement in looking at some of those other wine events, wine-specific events, we'd be keen to work with Wine Australia on that and continue the partnership where we've seen some really great interaction between Wine Australia and ourselves and the connections in market. Probably one thing I failed to mention at the start, Sarah, was that next year is also the 50th anniversary of the relationship between Australia and Vietnam. And so we are going to see, I think, a host of events across that year, probably starting from after Tet, so after the New Year period in about February or March next year, a series of different activations and events that will really showcase the relationship between Australia and Vietnam. And I would be amazed if wine wasn't a central feature at a lot of those different events and get-togethers. So it's a good time to start getting involved in Vietnam, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Something positive to look forward to. Thanks, Chris. That's it for questions for now. But if you do have any additional questions for Chris or Farhan, please drop them into the chat and we'll be happy to put them to Chris later. So now you've got a better understanding of the opportunities for wine in India and the landscape, not India, sorry, in Vietnam and the landscape there. I would like to hand over to Fran Baxter, who's the Executive Director for Value Learning, who along with Jenny Tran, the Marketing and Communications Consultant, will explore the cultural aspects that are important to understand before conducting business in Vietnam and to help you to really succeed in building the relationships there. So over to you, Fran, and to Jenny.
Thank you. Thanks. And it was very interesting to see the opportunities that are there in Vietnam. And we're really here now to talk a little bit more about how we might be able to capitalise on that by having a better understanding of how to do business, the cultural implications that we're going to find in Vietnam. So I'll just get Jenny to share our brief presentation. Awesome. Good. So very pleased to see you here today. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that I come to today, which are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So as you heard a little bit about us, so I'm the founder and director of Value Learning, along with my business partner Marcelo, who's currently in Argentina and hence the middle of the night there. We're consultants in the area of global competence and intercultural awareness. And so our aim is really to help businesses, educators, students, really right across the board, people to understand culture better in order to be able to interact in a more effective way when they're dealing with difference. And Jenny here, as you heard, is involved in marketing and communications. She's very actively involved in the Australia-Vietnam Leadership Dialogue, something that really gets young people engaged in the bilateral relationship and looks for opportunities to work in a more effective way there. And she's lived in Vietnam, Australia, in China, Malaysia, and really comes very well equipped to be able to be our cultural informant on this journey as we look for ways to improve our interactions with Vietnam. So a little bit about where we're heading today. We will introduce the concept of intercultural competence and culture, just a little bit about how it works, identify and find ways to navigate those differences, recognizing that we do interact differently, and the part that we play and how that can really improve our interactions, and discuss some specific cultural nuances around the Vietnamese culture and how we can really be more effective in this context. So we're going to start with a few facts, and I'm going to hand over to our expert, to Jenny, to talk a little bit more about that.
Great. Thanks so much, Fran, for the introductions. So just want to give you a little bit about the Vietnam facts here. So full name of Vietnam is Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and the capital city is Hanoi, with the largest city, Ho Chi Minh City. While English is gaining popularity, Vietnamese remains the dominant language and is spoken by 86% of the population. So therefore, when doing business in Vietnam, it's really important to have your marketing collaterals, whether that be your sales pitch, trade flyers, TVC in Vietnamese. And another very interesting fact about Vietnam is that we actually have 54 ethnic groups and over 110 local languages and dialects. But don't worry about that because the main language that I mentioned is Vietnamese, and the majority of Vietnamese people, they also identify themselves as irreligious, which means they don't associate themselves with any religion or follow folk beliefs. So within that 26.4% of the populations who's categorized as religious believers, the majority of them are Buddhists. There's also other interesting facts about Vietnam is that beside the main cities, Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, there are also other up-and-coming cities. For example, Hai Phong with over 900,000 people, Da Nang in the middle central coast of Vietnam with the populations of over 988,000, Thủ Đức City, very close to Ho Chi Minh City, Bien Hoa as well, and Can Tho. So even though there's like main city that you might have heard of, but also just to keep in mind that there's also quite a large spread out of the population across the city, across the country as well. So now let's talk about culture. I'll hand it back to you, Frank.
Thanks, Jenny. And we're certainly going to hear a lot more from Jenny as we break this down to some of the specifics. But when we talk about culture, and in particular about dealing across culture, we say that intercultural competence is the ability to interact effectively and appropriately with people from different cultural backgrounds. And what does that mean? Effectively means that I can get my message across in the way I intend, but appropriately means that it's in a way that works for the other. So if you're talking in this circumstance, you're talking about that your Vietnamese contacts, your purchasers, future purchasers, people that you're interacting with, the way you're interacting actually works for them. And this is where, you know, those differences can come into account. And when we look at how do we build our intercultural competence, become more culturally aware and be able to interact better and more appropriately, there are three key elements. The first is that we have to increase our own self-awareness. What do I know about the way that I interact? You know, how do I interact in my own environment? How do I interact in Australia? How do I interact when I'm dealing with people that are different? What do I know about my own cultural identity and behaviours? And then what do I know about others? So I guess that's what we're going to be focusing on a little bit more today. You know, what do I know about what works in Vietnam, about the way that Vietnamese operate in business, how they interact in their, you know, their habits, their buying habits and other things. So what do we know about others? And then how can we build the difference between the two? Because we are going to be different and there's value in that. But how can we interact in a way, how can we build the bridges so that we can be both effective, get my message across in the way that works, but also appropriate so that it works for the others. So that's kind of the concept behind intercultural competence when we talk about, you know, being effective and appropriate. So one of the things that we hear a lot about is, you know, oh, it's all about culture, but what is that? And so we would say that culture's it's a learned and shared patterns of beliefs, behaviours and values of a group of people. So really the culture, you have to have a group of people, and it can be, you can have a culture within a culture, you can have a culture, there's very many ways that we can look at this, but it's about people that interact with each other, and it tends to be passed down from one generation to another. So it's both how I behave, but also what underpins that. So what are the values and beliefs that really influence the way that I behave? So we find a really interesting way to think about this is by using the metaphor of the iceberg. And there's things that we can see above the waterline, about 10% really, and they're the things that become obvious when we think about another country. It might be how they dress, it might be the type of food, it could be, you know, festivals, the language. There's a number of things that are kind of evident when you travel, you can often see them, and you can recognise, that's, you know, that's indicative of this particular place or this particular culture. But really what underpins all that is the 90% that we don't see. but it influences how people behave. It influences the kinds of things that they do, the actions they take, and how they perceive our actions. And so they're a bit harder to kind of get your head around without forming a deeper relationship or having some additional learning. And it could be the style of communication, how we deal with conflict, how time is perceived, the idea of, time, short-term or really a long-term vision, how power is distributed, and how groups or individuals make decisions. And those things aren't always evident immediately, and usually take a little bit more, curiosity to discover, and also often an informant from within the culture to help you to recognise the signs. So I thought I might just look at the icebergs in a little bit more depth and say to Jenny, when you think about the Australian iceberg from a Vietnamese perspective, what are some of the things that, maybe come to mind when you were first exposed to what the culture of Australia might be?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think like when I first heard about Australia when I was a very young age, I think like the first thing came to my mind, obviously the Australian flag. And also I think like growing up knowing, Steve, like exposed to like Steve Irwin's series and so on. So I know of like the kangaroos and also like, the iconic Sydney Opera House. And barbecue. And then like when I first came to Australia, learning more about like the Australian footy rules. And yeah, so I think like that's the main thing when every time I think about Australia, they came first to my mind.
Uh-huh. Well, it's easy to see you're a Victorian. You could equally probably be a West Australian or a South Australian if the AFL is one of the first sports that come to mind.
Yeah, and my question to you too, Frank. So when you think of Vietnam, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Well, prior to going to Vietnam, I think that the first things that I thought about were Vietnamese food. I think it's really an important kind of element that's translated right around the world, and that's the different types of food. I was really fairly ignorant. I associated Vietnamese people with the conical hats, which I think you often saw in photographs. I knew it was probably going to be a fairly heavy culture on rice eating, and of course the history, I guess, of immigration between Vietnam and Australia. But apart from that, I really wasn't that knowledgeable. I've since come to learn that the concept of beer is kind of something as far as more popular as far as an alcoholic drink, and yes, now I can recognise the flag, of course, but again, it's that 10%, it's that top of the iceberg, which is often where we first experience our knowledge of a country. Where, of course, there's so much more to it than that. And so we're going to go into some of these below the surface elements associated with Vietnam. But if we look particularly at Australia, in general, we're very rule compliant. Our systems are quite transparent. We communicate fairly directly. We're often considered reasonably casual, and we have a very egalitarian, even kind of approach to as opposed to a hierarchical system. And our communication style, we would say, is low context, which means that we really spell things out in a lot of detail, use a lot of words to say something, not necessarily reading between the lines. And as we can see here, Jenny, I guess there's a lot of different elements that make up the Vietnamese culture that aren't necessarily evident when you first think about Vietnam.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're going to explore that further later down the track. But yeah, some of the things, for example, like, about the hierarchy of the society in Vietnam, about like, individualism versus like collectivism. So individualism associated with the Australian culture, and then more of a society network, collective networks in Vietnam, also like about indirect versus direct communications and the concept of face as well.
Mm-hmm. So what's really fascinating is when we look at a different culture, we do see it from our own perspective. So when I look at Vietnam or different cultures, different countries, I often see it in respect to what I know to be true within my own environment. So great quote there on the screen at the moment. We don't see things the way they really are. We tend to see them the way we are from our own perspective. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper now, and I'm going to ask Jenny to take over for a while and to tell us a little bit more about some of those specifics that are below the surface of our Vietnamese iceberg, and that are really going to help us to do business or to be more effective and appropriate when we're in Vietnam or dealing with the Vietnamese people.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So yeah, the first concept that I want to introduce everyone here today is the concept of face. So as with many other Asian countries, historic, Chinese rules and also the influence of Confucianism and Taoism in the region continue to shape their local beliefs, and the concept of face is extremely important in Vietnam. While in the West, being frank and direct is considered as a good trait, direct disagreement or raising of difficult questions in the public can cause the person to lose face in Vietnam. So face as a concept that can be roughly described as a reflection of a person's reputation, dignity, and also specialized. And the next one that we're going to talk about is the concept of indirect communications. So as we mentioned earlier, for Vietnamese, communication style is often indirect. So what does that mean? So it could be saying yes, but may merely indicate, understanding rather than an actual agreement. It's best to, in business setting, it's best to follow up and confirm with your business partner to understand if you have agreed on the matter, and also to avoid the loss of face. A Vietnamese person may seek to resolve issues in the workplace indirectly. For example, they might use a third person to reject a proposal, ask for feedback, or discuss the problems. It's also very common to have silence in a meeting, and silence in the meeting, that just means that your partners are thinking about your ideas, your interests, and interrupting this time of reflection can be considered as rude. Further, like silence can maybe used when someone disagrees, and when there is a point of tension or difficulty that can't be resolved. So this is just their way, like Vietnamese ways of allowing time. The conversation can simmer back to harmony, and so not cause a loss of face for attendees. So what are the tips for success when doing business in Vietnam, and dealing with people coming from having like indirect communication style? It's very important to ask questions and ask for clarifications. So as I mentioned, yes doesn't imply any sort of agreement. It can just mean, yep, they follow what you're saying. So it's very important to ask for those clarifications. There's also quite a high reliance on the non-verbal aspects when communicating, and ideas sometimes can be conveyed by suggestions. You should choose word like carefully when disagree as well, and silent is okay. And so when in meeting, if there's any silence, just respect that their time to think about whether that be business proposal or your ideas.
Jenny, that's really quite interesting, because I would say for many of us, silence is a very uncomfortable place. And often after, mere seconds, we're looking to fill the gaps with conversation because we feel a little bit uncomfortable. Would we just assume that all silences are just to be broken by the others, or, how do we move past that? Are there any tips for would a silence go on indefinitely, or would there, what happens next?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think When, for example, like when you encounter that sort of like uncomfortable feeling of like, is this silence going too long? Am I supposed to say something? Or you're not sure what to respond in that situation, I think the best way is just to ask questions and ask for clarification. So it could be just, for example, like, or just checking in like, oh, is everything okay? What I explained there, does that make sense? Or, just asking those questions to make sure like, oh, they on the same page with you. And if you need like a sort of like an agreement or like a definite yes from them or some sort of like definite answer, I think like it's quite important to ask them that question as well. And usually I think like for Vietnamese people, even though, our preferred communication style is indirect, I think when the questions is asked, and especially like if it's yes and no question, and then like I think that sort of like help them to frame the answer as well and give you the answer that you want. Yeah.
Good. Is it easier to get a direct question in one-on-one conversation than maybe in front of, their peers or maybe their, colleagues or management? If I wanted to get a direct, are there some conversations that are kind of taken offline?
Yep. I think like if it's a sort of like a group discussions or that requires everyone contribution, definitely have that as an open questions to the group. But if it's something more personal and you're afraid that it might make them feel uncomfortable, or like I mentioned before, like Vietnamese people quite sensitive to the concept of like losing face, so they don't want to lose face in front of their business partners or other team members. So if you think that the questions might cause any sort of like lost face, and I think it's more appropriate to ask those questions in private. Yeah.
Oh, good. Thanks.
Great. And the next concept that I want to introduce to everyone today is about the hierarchy. So relationship functions as a social basis for Vietnamese interactions. So while hierarchy is a salient normative basis, respectfulness is argued to be an attribute of hierarchy, and as it is a must-do in Vietnamese interactions to show the interactants' awareness of hierarchy. Hierarchy also dictates what socially and or morally acceptable behaviors. And don't be surprised if they want to know your age. That is the way of Vietnamese, people do to choose appropriate pronouns for respect and for more intimacy due to the rich need of pronouns in Vietnamese. So, for example, when I address someone, older than me, they might go with, a pronoun go, back, or chị. So, which mean like, sis, if we literally translate that into English, that would mean like sister, auntie. But yeah, because of the richness in Vietnamese pronouns, that's why a lot of time people might ask you for your age. And I think like in Western culture, that might be something we often avoid to talk about. But for Vietnamese culture, you will see that it's quite common, and it's not like a rude sort of like they don't want to disrespect you. But it's just a way of them finding out like what will be the best way to address you. And in a business setting, this also translates fluidly into defined hierarchical structures in a company with like clearly defined roles and manager subordinate expectation. So what are the tips for success when dealing with like hierarchy when working in Vietnam? A couple of example here can be like, showing the eldest person respect by giving them your business card first is appropriate behaviors. Or in Vietnam, people generally enter a meeting in order of importance. So it can be like the highest ranking person arriving first and then so on. The same also goes with introduction as well. When it goes around, usually, the person with the highest ranking in the company introduce himself first, followed by the lower rankings. When eating with your clients or your partner, make sure that you offer your drinks or milk to the most senior person first as a gesture of respect. And in terms of decision making, so decisions are often made by the superiors. And as I mentioned before, like sometimes in conversation, they might not want to have, thing discussed publicly. So they might also involve an intermediary, a third person to come into the conversation, and that person can be an intermediary between like a senior person versus like a more sort of like lower subordinate role.
So Judy, just confirming that the hierarchy would be related to age is definitely important, but also then role in the organisation. So the most senior kind of manager or person in the room would be another form of hierarchy. Is there anything else that could fit into that hierarchy? Is it gender neutral? Does it matter whether they're male or female? Does that have an impact?
I think like gender doesn't make quite a big impact when it comes to like business setting and hierarchy, but definitely like the tenure, one's person like tenure in the company, so how long they have been with the company. So if the person who has been in a company for a longer time, usually people tend to have more respect to that person than someone who just recently joined the company. But also it's quite because of the nuances in the hierarchy, in a business setting versus like in a society. So in a social setting, it usually goes by age. In a business setting, it usually goes by their title and also the tenure in the company. But if you're not sure about any of these etiquette, it's quite important to just check in with, your business partner and clients. And then like maybe perhaps asking them like who, would it be more appropriate for me to address this person first or that person first? Asking like them these questions is not disrespectful to your business partners, but it's just showing that you're open to learning and also like to make sure that you're doing the right thing when it comes to business etiquettes.
Oh, that's helpful. And I guess being observant, watching who comes into the room first or sits down first or is offered the drinks is going to give you a few insights into who they might be. Save upsetting any face or being disrespectful. Thank you.
Great, no worries. And the next one is about collectivism. So as mentioned earlier, Vietnam is a collective society. So social relationships are very crucial, and culture is strongly oriented around family and community because of the Confucian roots. So loyalty often overrides most of the other societal rules and regulations. Dining and drinking together is an essential part of community activities and in all and across Vietnam as well. So Vietnamese business people love spending, time socializing with their network. So that's why it's quite important to spend time on networking, building trust and relationship with your business partners. Some of the tip here that might be helpful for you when doing business in Vietnam as well is that as I mentioned, personal relationship play a very large role in Vietnamese business culture. Often third-party introductions are almost a necessity, as Vietnamese people prefer to work with those they already know or trust. For them, trust is a very important and a key to good business. And then many Vietnamese will ask you questions that may seem personal to a foreigner, for example, like about your age, marriage status, and then your personal life, your hobbies, and so on. And discussing one's family or personal life is quite normal and seen as a sign of friendliness and interested in you as a person within the Vietnamese culture. Vietnamese business relationship inevitably, becomes a social relationship. So after a while, so Vietnamese business is likely to make up their mind about a business deal just based on how they perceive their personal relationship with you. So don't underestimate the importance of informal gathering.
So socializing is really part of doing business.
Yep, absolutely. So I think Vietnam culture, has such a strong emphasis on dining, drinking together, gathering and community. So majority of the social sort of like activities will involve food and drinks, which is also an opportunity for you to introduce, your wine products to your business partners or, serve them in that context as well.
Mm-hmm. I noticed, Jenny, we just had a question in the chat around, are there differences in communication styles and cultures really evident between, you know, those in the North Sea in Hanoi and those in the South in Ho Chi Minh City? Are there demonstrable, you know, differences that we need to be mindful of?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the North and the South, so it's in the South, people tend to be more casual and relaxed. So I think it's like quite similar how, you know, different cities in Australia, we also have that perception, oh yeah, you're more chill here and then like you're acting a certain way. So I think when it comes to drinking wine or also like, you know, communication style as well, the Southern people often have a more of a relaxed, laissez-faire, laid-back communication style. So, for example, they also more often to or exposed to like foreign ideas, and while like for the northern people, it's because of, you know, the long history there. So then they often sometimes might be closed or reserved to certain ideas and communications. But that being said, I think like now we see that a lot of, you know, Vietnamese over like people going overseas and returning to the country. For the past few years, that have been back and forth between Australia and Vietnam doing business. I don't see that much sort of like difference between communication style, you know, of the North versus the South when it comes to doing business. But socially, yes, you know, it's often the Southern, you know, way of doing business or, you know, working is quite laid back compared to like the Northern way of working.
I guess it's one of those parts of the culture that evolves as well as, you know, as there's more movement both internally and then in and out of the country, it starts to impact on how people behave or how they adapt their style as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Good.
And yeah, and the next one is about religion and superstitions, really quite fascinating, because this is something that, you know, we often coming from, you know, Western culture where there's a very clearly defined, you know, religions and who you should associate with or you don't believe in religions. In Vietnam, it's quite of a blurred line because of the diversity in like folk religions. So Vietnamese people tend to have like a fatalistic attitude. So they believe that circumstances are the result of a predetermined destiny and may take a more reactive approach to problems. So some common Vietnamese business practices, for example, they might go to see a fortune teller, you know, at the beginning of the year or during like Lunar New Year. There might be a prayer rituals and offerings at the launch of a big projects. And you might see like some of the statues, you know, placed in the office as well. For example, a very popular one is a lucky toad statue. And sometimes even like an altar to attract wealth and fortune to the office. Lucky colors to wear to important business meetings. So some people do believe that, you know, there's a certain colors that associate to their lucks, and then that's why they tend to wear a certain colors when they go to important business meetings. And business gifts sometimes are also based on lucky colors of the receiver. So I know that that's a lot of information, but you know, when it comes to religion and superstition as well, there's no expectations of foreign business partners to follow these rituals, but it's quite important to recognize and be aware of them, and especially when it comes to gift giving. You know, carefully research of your client's lucky color to appropriately color code their gift.
Jenny, how would I know that? Where would I look for that? Would that be something that I would see in their logo or, you know, in their, you know, their marketing material? Are they likely to use, you know, their lucky colors in that way? Or would I need to be more direct and ask, you know, ask somebody that question?
Yeah, good questions. So I think usually if it's like they often like the people like business partner who actually like have a very strong belief in these sort of like superstitions or rituals, they really show you like, you know, especially like it comes up really strong like in the very couple of first meetings. For example, like the way that they dress, a certain color of, their notepads, pens, and also like even you will see like these statues in their office as well if you have them meeting at their office. But at the same time, like as Vietnam evolves, I see that a lot of companies and a lot of business partners, they don't really follow these superstitions at all. So it's quite so it's even like in the first meeting, maybe be a little bit more observant to how they dress and then like how the certain color that they use. And if not, no stress about it, because like there's not a very strong emphasis on or no expectation on like, you need to know what color is appropriate or not. But when you do know the color, it also shows that you're actually putting an effort in fostering that relationship with them, and they really appreciate it. So whether you can ask their personal assistant or just by being observing to how they dress and the color that they often use, could be helpful. Great. So next one, we'll talk about some of the general tips and tricks for you to do business in Vietnam. So as I mentioned earlier, Vietnamese is the main language used in the country. And even though English is gaining popularity, it's quite important to have your marketing collaterals in Vietnamese, and just learn some, simple phrases in Vietnamese, such as like xin chào, which means hello, or cảm ơn, is thank you. And you don't need to be fluent, in Vietnamese to do business in Vietnam. People are very Vietnamese attitudes to foreigners are very welcoming, and very hospitable. So they will try their best to also communicate with you in English or whatever language that you feel comfortable with. But yeah, just knowing those simple phrases is really helpful, and also to show, your show your appreciation to the culture, and your willingness to learn from them as well. Business decisions and negotiations. So for those the medium of communications is Zalo, which is like the Vietnamese messenger and file sharing app. Another common one is also Facebook Messenger. And don't assume that all Vietnamese act the same. So I mentioned, some, for example, like about the superstitions, like some people do follow them and then some don't. And as a lot of Vietnamese people go overseas for study or work and now coming back to the country, there's also like all of that traditions and ritual they may or may not follow anymore. And so that's some of the tips and tricks that I hope will help you when doing business in Vietnam. And next we're going to talk about the alcohol consumption, and where is wine consumed in Vietnamese culture, when is it consumed, and when is wine gifted. So just a couple of ones. So drinking alcohol, impregnates in every fabric of Vietnamese society. On special occasions after work, catching up with friends and family, and their Vietnamese people, as for business people, they invite each other to meet their partners according to the custom of drinking wine is the beginning of the story, and as a premise for social meetings and mutual understanding. So in particular, as I think Chris mentioned earlier in the session as well, so Vietnamese are actually not used to drinking Western wine. So even though Vietnam is the third biggest market for beer worldwide, it's quite important to also just assume that, there's still a knowledge gap in wine consumption and also wine serving. So come that with an open mind, willingness to, share information about wine with your business partner, and don't assume that they have the same level of knowledge as you.
Jenny, I'm interested. Are people interested in learning? Are younger people becoming more interested in wine, for instance? Are they showing an interest in, understanding more about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like for the younger market, because as more young people like have that opportunity to go overseas and also exposed to like the Western culture, they also pick up on these like, you know, wine drinking etiquettes, and also like be open to learning more about, you know, different ways of, you know, drinking and dining and so on. So yeah, so there's quite a, you know, an appetite for what, like learning about wine and also drinking wine in Vietnam. However, like in terms of the knowledge, so there's still quite a big knowledge gap when it comes to wine. And yeah, so that's why quite important to come in with an open mind, and, you know, just don't assume that we all have the same knowledge as, you know, the consumers in like more of a Western country. And yeah, and so the Vietnamese way of drinking is quite special. You may be seen as impolite if you drink alone, and everyone loves, you know, having a party and involving, you know, alcohol in there. So it's quite everyone's habit to only drink after toasting. So it's common to hear very loud toast and, you know, glass clinking on the street, and that's just an indication there's a party nearby. And the drinking culture also reflects on consumer behavior, and understanding it is quite important. So before, the questions about, you know, the northern versus the south. So northern Vietnam-based consumer tend to be trend followers, and they pay really strong attention to packaging, especially for gifted products, and have considerable knowledge of different brands. And this is actually a research conducted by EPOS University, and reveals, you know, there's a crucial differences in alcoholic consumption behavior of people living in the main regions of Vietnam. Then when we move down to the central Vietnam-based consumer, they tend to be more reserved, less willing to try new brands, and prefer local brands. The absence of a variety of brands can be a key reason for this trend, and by contrast, people living in southern Vietnam are classified as an easygoing consumer who are willing to try new brands and are a bit more knowledgeable about different brands. And it's quite common for Vietnamese businessmen to participate in drinking, and you might see, you know, there's a more of male drinking alcohol than like the proportions in female. And as for men, how successful you are often viewed by how much you drink alcohol, and how much you can tolerate during special occasions. So even though drinking has become more normalized among Vietnamese women, some still might feel uncomfortable to drink with male business partner due to the association of, like, you know, female alcohol serving to like promotion girls. When it comes to the occasion that most of Vietnamese people consume wine or alcohol in general, that is the most important festival and public holiday in Vietnam. And at this time, as Chris shared before, you might see a spike in, you know, purchase on wine as a gift as well. So for that is another name. So it's a Vietnamese name for Lunar New Year, and it's a time for renewal celebrations, connecting with friends and family. So in a business setting, definitely avoid scheduling meetings or business trips during this Lunar New Year period, because it's really for your business partner, Vietnamese business partner, to spend this time with their family and community. Gift exchanging is very common custom during that holiday. So a lot of businesses, they tend to buy, you know, a gift packaging for their business partner, and it's their way of, you know, wishing their business partner a good relationship in the upcoming year. And this is not only a great occasion to sell wine, but also a great opportunity to acknowledge your appreciation towards, like, not only your business partners, but also like the government regulators who have already supported you throughout your, you know, business, doing business in Vietnam. And packaging and presentations are quite important. So whether you are giving gift or trying to position your products to appeal to New Year shoppers, trying to make it as part of the experience. So think about how you're offering for Lunar New Year shoppers, like whether that be a focus on family value, their gathering activities, and how you can incorporate that into your packaging or the way that you offer your wine products as well.
Very handy, Jenny, having your expertise in marketing and understanding the local market here, because I guess some of the things we're hearing would be quite different to what we might experience in Australia. For instance, trying to woo your government kind of contacts might not be something that's common practice within the Australian setting, but obviously quite important in Vietnam. Yeah, good to know. Good.
Okay. So that's the end of my presentations about the Vietnamese cultural awareness. But now we going to watch a video shared by Pam, who works in the hospitality industry in Vietnam, and she will share some of the tips and what she finds, interesting about the Vietnamese way of drinking and also consuming wine.
When people usually come over here and set up business, I give them some advice on this to, 1, drop your ego, 2, be flexible, be adaptable, take time, be patient. But these are less on, I think, Western versus Eastern ways. It's more relaxed.
When people usually come over here and set up business, I give them some advice on this too. 1, drop your ego.
For example, relationships are very important. You want to get to know the person you're working with first before you plan to sign anything. People want to trust you. People want to understand you. Here in Vietnam, I think we find that work-life balance a bit better than we do in the West. What I'd like to see change on both sides is, I always talk about this difference between servant and service mentality. So I think in Asia and Vietnam, traditionally or stereotypically or by history, there's a little bit of this servitude mentality, being very formal, being conservative. Even in the Vietnamese language, you address people by how old they are. So it's very hierarchical. You ask how old you are and you address them, and you put yourself in the position if you're higher or lower as soon as you meet them. So from an F&B hospitality side, on both, it'd be great to see foreigners, expats, people who are not native locals here to come in and not to be so hierarchical. Like if we can get on this more equal playing field of, I'm here to serve you, I'm not here to be your servant, and vice versa. Remember, you're a guest in this country. No one asked you to come here. You are welcomed in, and keep that in mind when you try to do business. This is not America number 2 or Australia number 2. You are in a completely new country, and be respectful, be mindful of that, and go beyond that and celebrate, embrace, get to know the culture, and not try to just implement for your own values and mentalities and how business should be done or how business is done back home here, because you're not back home, right? You came here for a reason. So embrace that.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. We're really keen to answer any additional questions that you might have. Got a few minutes now available if you've, got anything specific around interactions with your, potential customers or current colleagues within Vietnam, or any what ifs. We're certainly happy to help. I think, Sarah, there might be a couple of other questions, so I'm not sure if the... I'm sorry.
Yeah, myself. There's nothing additional come through yet, Fran, but please, if you think of anything even after this session, send them through to us, and we'll be able to get Fran or Jenny or even Chris or Han to help answer any burning questions that you might have that come to you at a later time. So we might wrap things up in that case, if there's nothing else on the chat. Thanks very much, Fran and Jenny. There's some hugely valuable information there, and hopefully everyone now feels like they've got all the tools they need to really succeed in doing business in Vietnam and entering Vietnam as a new export market. So thank you both for your insights and thoughts and contributions today. It's been really, really valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, and good luck to everyone on the call with your future sales. Hope they go well.
Today's session's been recorded, so if there's anything you missed or want to catch up on, you can do so. We'll email you the link when it's live on our website after this. So thank you all again for joining the Vietnam Market Briefing and Cultural Awareness Training. And thank you also to Chris and Han again, who presented earlier. And we hope to see you all for the next session that we run. Thanks very much, everyone.